My goal for this first section of the course is to give you an appreciation for the extent to which what we perceive of as reality is really an illusion constructed by our brains. In previous lectures, we saw how perception is not only highly filtered but also constructed. Memories are also not only constructed but reconstructed every time we access a memory. And our brains further assign patterns to what we perceive of emotion and instinct. The neocortex is the most recently evolved part of our brain. It's involved with social behavior, long-term planning, and inhibition or restraint. Often, however, rather than imposing this long-term planning and restraint on our more primitive desires, the neocortex may rationalize decisions that were made for us by these more primitive regions. For example, let's say you want to eat a particularly delicious looking piece of cheesecake. The more primitive parts of your brain are motivating you with hunger and are telling you that it's going to taste good. You're going to feel good when you eat that cheesecake. You want to eat it. Your neocortex, however, might say, wait a minute, I really shouldn't have those extra calories. This is not in my long-term best interest in terms of my health, etc. And so these two brain regions come into conflict, and some resolution will come out of that. Either the neocortex will win and be able to restrain your behavior, or it may rationalize the decision made by the more instinctive part of the brain. It may, for example, say, well, I'll exercise a little bit harder tomorrow, or I really didn't eat that much today, so it's okay for me to have a cheesecake, or I've already worked so hard, so I deserve a little reward. The conflict will be resolved one way or the other. And when it is, our brains will then give us a little shot of dopamine, which is the reward neurotransmitter, and it will make us feel good about resolving that conflict. Throughout this lecture, I'm going to refer to a couple of pieces of modern technology that we use to investigate brain function. The first is functional MRI scanning, using a magnetic resonance imager in order to not only look at the brain, but to see how the brain is functioning in real time. It is a functional scan of the brain. The other is transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a technique for either increasing or decreasing different regions or circuits within the brain. This way we can tell what they contribute to the overall functioning of the brain. In essence, what modern neuroscience researchers are finding are the neurocorrelates to what, in some cases, psychologists have been demonstrating for decades. We can see different brain regions in conflict. We can see the conflict resolution, and then we experience that we experience as a decision or a rationalization. In other words, our decisions seem like they are conscious. We experience consciously making a decision. However, decisions are often made subconsciously. They are made by a calculus, an evolutionary neurobiological calculus that we are not aware of. For example, a 2008 study published in Nature magazine For example, social cues. We respond quite a bit to body language, facial expression, and other things in ways that we're not consciously aware of. We just know that we feel a certain way about someone or about a situation without being able to consciously deconstruct exactly why we feel that way. Emotions are involuntary and subconscious. We don't choose to feel angry, we just feel angry. We then invent a reason to explain why we feel a certain way with varying degrees of insight. Explanations we invent, by the way, are typically highly self-serving. We're very easy on ourselves when we're explaining our own feelings and behavior. This subconscious processing goes beyond emotions, however. It also extends to other types of processing, like searching for a particular memory or even problem solving. For example, have you ever had the experience of looking for something that you misplaced, and then at some time, when you're not even consciously focusing on the problem anymore, the answer just, quote unquote, pops into your head. You suddenly remember where you left your car keys, for example. That's is involved with what we call the theory of mind, the ability to think about the intentions of other people. Essentially, this is the part of the brain that gives us the insight, understanding into the fact that other people have their own mind, their own will, their own agency, and then therefore we can speculate about what someone else might be intending to do. Obviously a very adaptive thing to be able to do in a social species. When that part of the brain was inhibited, it altered the ability of subjects to make moral judgments, those moral judgments that specifically require a theory of mind in the calculus. For example, if the intention of another person was important to deciding how guilty they are, did they intend harm or was it an accident, then the ability to make that moral judgment was impaired by magnetically decreasing the function of a specific piece of the brain. Cravings are another example. The insular cortex is often responsible for translating physical sensations into emotions. For example, interpreting a rapid heartbeat as feeling anxious, but also interpreting the symptoms of physical withdrawal into cravings for the thing. one part of the brain to another part of the brain, decreasing the number and severity of those seizures, hopefully. So these patients, about 90% of the communication between the two halves of their brain is therefore separated. This creates a wonderful opportunity to test the aggregate consciousness of one hemisphere separate from the aggregate consciousness of the other hemisphere. This means that the two hemispheres contribute their own bit of consciousness but are not combining them together. So, for example, in one classic experiment, the experimenters would show a series of objects to the right hemisphere of the subject with the split brain. The right hemisphere in most people is the non-dominant hemisphere and the one that is not engaged in language. So the right hemisphere, in essence, is mute. It doesn't have the ability to speak or to understand language. The left hemisphere is where language is. But because the two hemispheres of the brain were separated, they were able to show only the right hemisphere an object and then see how the individual responded to that information. So in one example, they would show a subject something like a bottle of Coca-Cola, and then just the right hemisphere. And then they would, immediately after that, show the subject a series of objects, of 20 objects or so, one of which is a bottle of Coca-Cola. A self-contained entity. But infants actually do not appreciate, as far as we could tell, where they end and the rest of the universe begins. They feel, in other words, one with the universe. There are drugs that can inhibit brain regions, like the temporal lobes, that are involved in this feeling of separateness, that we are a separate entity from everything else. And when those brain regions are inhibited, that can give an individual a powerful sense of being one with the universe, which is often interpreted as a profound spiritual experience. But it's really just inhibiting a very fundamental way in which our brains construct our sense of self and reality. The sensation of being inside your body, usually we feel as if not only do we occupy our bodies, but we exist somewhere behind the eyes. That is also a specifically constructed experience inside the brain, and researchers are developing a model of what parts of the brain contribute to that process. These parts of the brain also can be inhibited by drugs, by transcranial magnetic stimulation more precisely, or more generally by oxygen deprivation. What we find is that when you do this, this causes subjects to have an out-of-body experience. They feel as if not in control of my own arm. This is very similar to the phantom limb phenomenon. So the ownership, in this case, the ownership module still owns a limb, but the limb is either dead or is even not there. Amputees often experience this. So for example, that circuitry in the brain that is telling me that I own and control my left arm might still be functioning even after my left arm is amputated, so I will perceive as if there's a limb that's not there. This can result bizarrely in what's called a supernumerary phantom limb. This is a very rare syndrome that has been described numerous times, however, in the neurological literature. What happens is if a stroke eliminates the motor control of a limb so that the limb is paralyzed, but it doesn't disrupt the ownership module circuitry, then that ownership module still functions, but it doesn't have a limb to control. So it in essence manufactures a virtual limb that it can control. It creates the illusion of an extra arm perhaps emerging from the middle of my body. I will see that extra limb that's not really there. I will feel it. I will be able to control it by my own perceptions. If it itches, I'll be able to scratch it and relieve the itch. Of course, the only thing I won't be able to do with it is to manipulate external reality, because this limb only exists as a construct in my brain. There is even one case in the literature of a man after suffering a stroke who had 6 supernumerary limbs emerging from his body. These later did disappear. The brain is plastic and can adjust to these lesions, and so this is often a temporary phenomenon. I mentioned previously alien hand syndrome. This is the opposite disconnection from a phantom limb, where the sensory information does not match the motor intentions. And this is often a fascinating syndrome. For example, subjects who suffer from this may feel as if their hand is acting on its own accord. There is one case, for example, in which a woman was emptying the contents of her purse onto the ground and had no awareness that her hand was doing this. To her perceptions, it was acting all on its own. Here's, however, is a more everyday example of a little bit of a disconnect between our consciousness and our motor control. It's called the ideomotor effect. The ideomotor effect is essentially subconscious motor control, little motor movements that serve a purpose, but that we are not fully conscious of. Probably like it's happening all by itself. Dowsing is yet another example where people will hold divining rods and they will appear to move when they get over a target area. For example, if they're looking for running water, when they walk over an underground location of water, the rods will move together. But it's been clearly demonstrated over and over again in research that the movements of the rods are done by subconscious ideomotor control of the person holding them, and that they only really, quote unquote, work when the person using them knows when they're supposed to move. If they are blinded to the target, the effect of dowsing disappears, consistent with the ideomotor effect. Perhaps the most serious example of the ideomotor effect is facilitated communication. In the late 1980s, some researchers felt that they had hit upon a method of communicating with impaired children who did not have the ability to communicate, whether or not they were autistic or developmentally delayed or had some kind of a brain injury or developmental problem that impaired their consciousness, their cognitive function, and impaired their ability to communicate. The idea was that maybe some of these children actually are a lot brighter than they appear to be. They have a much more or there are situations in which we actually can be motivated to turn off, if you will, our critical thinking. Research has demonstrated that when subjects are confronted with a very charismatic person, for example, especially when that person is identified with our own in-group, if we think that they are quote-unquote one of us, that subjects will tend to turn off their critical thinking. In a very real sense, they will surrender their will to the charismatic person. For whatever reason, we evolved to do just that. A recent fMRI study, in fact, could see this happening, could see different parts of the brain being inhibited when confronted by a charismatic person, in a similar process to being hypnotized. So it may turn out that when somebody uses the phrase that the crowd was hypnotized by the speaker, they may be literally correct. That's not just a metaphor, that a charismatic person may be able to hypnotize a crowd by turning off their critical thinking, making them susceptible to suggestion in the same way that a hypnotist does. All of this brings up the question of free will. This is a tricky philosophical question that I really can't